Niña, yo recuerdo la pena y el dolor y este sentimiento de duda y de rencor. Bella, ya tú sabes, me quiero redimir. Tú tienes la llave que calma mi sufrir y tú te vas, tú te vas. Y yo sin ti, yo sin ti. Y tú te vas, tú te vas. Y yo sin ti, yo sin ti.
And I'll be chairing this session, and for this session it's a keynote address, and it's by Joan Casanovas, who's from the Universidad Rovira y Virgili in Tarragona. Joan has written extensively on labour in Cuba in the 19th century. He has quite a few books out on various aspects of this topic, including Bread or Bullets, Urban Labour and Spanish Colonialism in Cuba, 1850 to 1898. Before commencing, I'd just like to say that Joan is here in part because of funding from the Spanish government. So thank you to the Spanish government for that, even though he's a Catalan. And today he's going to be speaking to us about indentured apprenticeship in Havana, 1839 to the 1860s. He'll speak for about 40 minutes, and after that we'll have question time. So we have an hour and a half for this session, so we should be fairly relaxed about it all. All right, thank you, and Joan.
Thank you very much, Peter. I want to thank very much ILASA, the Association of Latin American Studies, Iberian and Latin American Studies of Australasia. I'm really impressed of being in Australasia. It scares me the idea of having these two oceans side by side. And also, of course, I want to thank very much John Means for being so kind and having invited me to this conference. Barricade, of course, has been really nice to me for this invitation. And of course to the organizers, that they have been so welcoming and so hospitalarios. When I arrived here, it's been really marvelous to arrive and be so well welcomed. Now, today I'm going to talk about a very specific issue, the particular apprenticeship system that was established in Cuba, or Western Cuba, in the cities between 1839 and the 1860s. It's not exactly clear when the system ended, but from references I found, I know it was in the late 1860s when it ended. The slave society in Cuba and the Americas imposed extremely hard living and working conditions to slaves, but it also hardened these conditions for free or semi-free workers, and even urban slaves who worked as self-employed artisans. The Cuban elite constantly searched how to impose the maximum coercion possible to all laborers. As a result of this effort, besides slavery, we find several kinds of unfree labor in Cuban cities in the 19th century. The study of their origin, evolution, and the response from workers they sparked is essential to understand the history of urban workers in Cuba in the context of a slave society. In this presentation, I will focus on one of the semi-free forms of labor coercion that the Cuban elite devised and implemented for workers between the 1830s and 1860s, a particular system of indentured apprenticeship. Most studies of Cuban slave society have focused on rural slavery, particularly on slavery in sugar plantations. In the case of Cuba, we have a fragmented picture of the history of urban slavery. However, in the case of Brazil, we have several impressive studies about slavery in big cities like Rio de Janeiro. So really, Brazil, it's a leading country in studies of slavery. In the 1830s, slave society in Cuba was at its peak, and until 1867, the slave trade would continue to bring illegally thousands of slaves into the island. Nonetheless, in this period, the Creole elite started to see the need to find a gradual way to overcome slavery. On the one hand, the white elite formulated one of its basic principles, which was it was necessary to whiten the popular classes through mestizajes, through whitening. On the other hand, the elite sought the establishment of intermediate forms of labor between chattel slavery and free labor. The Cuban elite feared that too many slaves and free blacks in Cuba could spark a slave revolution like the Haitian between 1791 and 1804. The elite was worried about the sudden end of slavery in Cuba, especially after the abolition of slavery in the nearby British colonies in 1834, when 800,000 slaves were freed, and the French colonies in 1848, when about 250,000 slaves were freed. On the other hand, this elite wanted to expand its political power within Spanish colonial rule, and as long as slavery was the key element of Cuban society, Spain would always argue that Cuba had to be under the absolute power of a military governor, the Captain General, appointed by the metropolitan government. Although the traditional Cuban nationalist history emphasized that the Cuban elite was oppressed by Spanish colonialism, actually the largest part of this elite was very glad that authoritarian rule was in Cuba, because whenever a more flexible form of government came from Spain, they got very scared that this would break slave society. So although historiography has presented the constant oppression of the Spanish colonial rule over the colonial elite, that's not the case at all. Nonetheless, this elite was more or less put aside from the top positions of political power in the island. So they wanted to increase this position within the colonial administration in the island, and if possible, even in Madrid. The flexibility of urban slavery in Iberian America, in Brazil and Hispanic America, created a particular situation. On the one hand, slavery tended to toughen working conditions for juridically free urban laborers. But on the other, these laborers lived and worked alongside slave artisans, which helped the latter to enjoy the sort of semi-free condition. Even if they were slaves, they had certain conditions that allowed them to behave almost as free workers in certain aspects. Contrary to the great majority of rural slaves, most slave artisans, and even urban slaves in general, in Cuba and Brazil, could purchase their freedom gradually through a system called coartación, or self-purchase. Thus, in Latin American cities like Havana, San Juan de Puerto Rico, Rio de Janeiro, where slavery was a key element, there wasn't a clear dividing line between free labor and slave labor. Instead, as the 19th century advanced, we find that the popular classes constantly blurred these social categories. Several works on race relations in Cuba in the 20th century show the flexibility of a society that until 1896, when the Spanish government abolished slavery in Cuba, slavery had been its key element. Nonetheless, few of these works on the 20th century mention that already in the 19th century, despite the existence of slavery, labor and social relations among the popular classes were already very flexible among people of different race, degree of freedom, and even origin, either native Cuban or Spanish from the peninsula. Well, here we have a map of Western Cuba. We already see that in the 1840s, Western Cuba had a massive network of railways. It was a sort of macro-urban area, very well interconnected. In cities like Havana in the 19th century, with a population that went from 94,000 inhabitants in 1827 to nearly 200,000 in 1862, we find semi-free workers such as indentured apprentices, soldiers making cigarettes in military barracks, Chinese contract laborers, cigar makers working under a sort of debt peonage system called the libreta, shop assistants who didn't have a single day of the week to rest, and other smaller categories. Among these categories, I will focus on the particular indentured apprenticeship system that the Cuban elite established in Western Cuba between the 1830s and 60s, because it illustrates very well the ambiguities and contradictions of urban slave society. I will also make a reference to the booklet of the cigar maker, which is closely related to indentured apprenticeship. Well, this is the city of Havana in the 1880s, but we have the intramural city here, which can be visited today. It's one of the best preserved intramural cities in Latin America. And then the extramural city is this area here that in the 1830s and 40s reached till this area here, and these neighborhoods here were already being populated. So the city didn't change this much by the time of this map, the 1880s. It kept increasing, but in the 1830s we already find more or less this city. When I started to research on indentured apprenticeship in Cuba, initially I thought it could be a useless effort because it was a system that never managed to include the majority of apprentices in Havana, and even a smaller proportion of apprentices in cities and towns in Western Cuba. Nonetheless, as I researched more on this subject in Cuban archives and libraries, I started to see that by studying these middle ground workers, it was possible to have a much broader understanding of urban slave society. The causes of this particular apprenticeship system established in 1939 are: 1. Disentanglement of church properties in the late 1830s and early 1840s. Beneficence, education services traditionally offered by the church now were taken by the administration because of the Spanish liberal or bourgeois revolution of the 1830s. And then these services were no longer offered by the church, so the elite was worried about what would happen to so-called barons, orphans, people who were not directly controlled either as slaves or under the rule of their guardians or parents. You know? So the economic society, which occupied buildings that had been taken from the church recently, started to debate about how to offer these services, but not through the church, but directly by the administration. So the elite, through the economic society, was eager to provide services that would decrease crime and labor indiscipline, and yet increase economic production within a slave society. Second, the Cuban elite was seeking a gradual, very slow transition to free labor, and the 8-year apprenticeship system applied to freed slaves in the British colonies after the abolition of slavery in 1834 offered an example of how to coerce juridically free labor into forced labor. Nonetheless, the apprentices in the British colonies were mostly rural ex-slaves, freed slaves, starting to get full freedom, while in Cuba the indentured apprentices were mostly boys and some girls, very few girls, coerced into this system by the administration with the consent of their parents or legal guardians, if they were available. If not, the administration would indenture them anyway. If they were, for instance, street boys, you know, that were asking for money, committing petty crimes, then the administration would arrest them and put them into this indenture. Also, there's a need or a desire to offer, to satisfy labor demand. The need to find cheap labor, above all, for the expanding tobacco industry in Havana and nearby towns was a major force for establishing this indenture. Wages in Cuban cities were high, and displaced workers, including slaves who hired themselves out, so-called esclavos jornaleros, in a strong bargaining position. So the elite wanted to weaken the bargaining position of workers, even slaves in Havana. Also, there was the need of trying to find alternatives to slavery. No? The prospect of supplying forced labor to plantations from Cuban cities instead of the slave trade and the increasing danger of, to avoid the increasing danger of a slave revolt that entailed. So it was an attempt to decrease the slave trade, bringing slaves from Africa into Cuba, as a way to balance, to keep a certain balance between black people and white people in the black population, the white population in the island, and to avoid a sharp increase in the number of slaves. So indenture could help supply forced labor to the plantations. That was something that was debated. It failed at that, but it was in the debate. Then the constant problem of the Cuban elite, that was the attempt by the elite to whiten urban trades until it dominated the trades that till then we find the majority of black workers. So it was part of this whitening process about which the Cuban elite has been debating up till the 20th century, no? This obsession about making Cuba more white. Then, of course, there was the idea that through indenture, it was possible to sustain these institutions like the beneficence house or even the jail system, no? By putting prisoners into work or by having orphan children working in workshops, then these institutions would become less expensive for the public administration. Then it's quite interesting to see that there was also the desire to weaken the possibility that artisans establish labor unions, or so-called guilds, like the ones that had already been established by the time in Catalonia. For instance, in 1835 there was a failed attempt to create a cigar makers union in Havana. And also there was the possibility that the old neighborhood brotherhoods or cofradías, with the patron saint, which often were racially integrated already in this period and before in the 18th century, we have that brotherhoods could be racially integrated. So there was an attempt at all these organizations and all guilds that had already almost been destroyed. There was an attempt, or there was the attempt to make sure that could not become unions. Already there had been union experiences in the metropolis, or specifically in Catalonia, that really scared the Cuban elite in a slave society that unions could come into Cuba. So by having the apprenticeship system out of interference from unions was one of the desires of this elite. Although the Crown Society never mentioned in this case about the brotherhoods, it is clearly expressed in its distrust towards an industrial economy based on free labor. According to this elite, Cuba had to remain rural to preserve social order. Curiously, as a model to create these forms of coerced labor, always this elite looked above all to France, because France, since Napoleonic years, had established several mechanisms to coerce free labor or to keep it under control. Of course, Napoleon was the hero of the French bourgeoisie, created all these mechanisms to control labor. No? Well, here we have tobacco exports between 1826 and 1840. We see that raw tobacco, cigars, torcido in Spanish, we see how much it increased. Then we also see the value, how much it increased. And rama means tobacco leaf. No? Between 1820 and the late 1830s, sugar, tobacco leaf, and manufactured tobacco production expanded enormously. In the countryside, the fields continued to expand over the tropical forest, the manigua, while cities grew non-stop. In Havana and its nearby towns, we found concentrated 90% of cigar manufacturing. In Cuba, after cigar manufacturing in Cuba, after the suppression of in 1817 of the royal monopoly on tobacco growing, manufacturing, and commercialization, many small tobacco workshops surfaced throughout the city. In the 1830s, the first large tobacco factories began to be established. They can be visited now in Havana. No? a trend that expanded in the 1840s. Legal cigar exports went from 26 million per year cigars in 1826 to more than 100 million in the late 1830s and more than 200 million in several years from the 1840s on. Besides legal exports, Cuba exported an important quantity of cigars through contraband, but we don't know its exact proportion. No? Even now, contraband in cigars is taking place in Cuba because there's so much value in such a tiny product, and it's good for contraband. So still now we have this. Labor demand for the tobacco industry increased proportionally. In the 1830s, cigar manufacturing grew so much that Havana became the city of cigars. In 1859, between 1/3 and maybe 1/2 of the city's population was directly or indirectly involved in their manufacture, a proportion maintained well in the 20th century. In 1834, the Creole elite, or Sacaracracy, in the words of the historian Manuel Moreno Freginals, began to formally debate on the necessity to establish a system of indentured apprenticeship. The main promoter of this system was Juan Agustín de Ferretti, a member of the Creole elite who strongly supported Spanish rule. Although Spanish colonial policy excluded Creole from the regular army and the top positions in the island's administration, the Cuban elite had enormous influence on economic policy and anything related to social services offered by the administration, such as basic education, the teaching of manual trades, prisons, healthcare, communications, and other services. The main platform of the Creole elite was the Economic Society of Friends of the Country, in Spanish, Sociedad Económica de Amigos del País, established in Havana in 1792, 3 years after the founding of a smaller one in Santiago de Cuba, in the eastern part of the island. The Economic Society offered advice to the Captain General and his close collaborators, and offered some public services financed by the administration through donations, such as basic schools and healthcare, specifically vaccination. The Economic Society was very good at vaccinating a large part of the Cuban population already in this period. The Havana Economic Society was the institution that debated and implemented the indentured apprenticeship, established between July 1839 and the 1860s. Already in 1830, the society mentioned the need that all children had to learn a manual trade. A year later, in 1831, José Antonio Sacco, the leading intellectual of the Cuban sugar elite from the 1830s until his death in 1879, won a prize of the Economic Society for a report on vagrants in Cuba. According to Sacco, the Cuban cities were full of places of vice, where the people of different race mixed and socialized. He was particularly worried about the corrupting influence of gambling, the selling of lottery tickets in cafes and the streets, cockfighting fences, where Cubans always married regardless of their race or freedom of status. Really, the peleas de gallos always were a place where everybody met. Even in the 20th century, I had a friend who told me that in Trinidad in the 1950s, it was a quite segregated city, but when the matters came into talking about baseball, there was no racial line. So baseball really has followed the tradition through the peleas de gallos. Lottery tickets, cockfighting fences, billiards, and dancing hats. Also, Sacco complained about the numerous holidays throughout the year that allow artisans and peasants to mock religion by spending time on vices. According to him, it was necessary to reduce festivities and to open promenades, walks, paseos, cultural centers such as Ateneos or museums, where the popular classes could relax and expand their knowledge away from vice. As a remedy, Sacco also suggested that vagrants be used to build and repair roads. Once in good condition, these roads would help increase exports. Another remedy Sacco suggested in the building of poor houses, another remedy Sacco suggested is the building of poor houses, or houses for poor people, or workhouses, like the ones built in the UK and the United States to reform migrants at the same time that they produced wealth to sustain these houses. Thus, jails had to become penitentiaries. Any institution that could help in this enterprise had to be used. For instance, Sacco mentioned that the Beneficence House for orphan children, founded in 1793, could become a sort of workhouse where white and black children would receive education and learn a trade. Well, here we see proportion of slaves, free blacks and whites in urban in workshops in Havana. No? This is part of the problems that Sacco mentioned. I'll talk about in a second. We see that really, if we add slaves and free blacks, they outnumber whites, especially in the intramural city where the proportion of black people was enormous. If we look at the main trades in Havana, we have that, well, here we have percentage of artisans according to trade. We see that cigarette making employed mostly soldiers and people, women working at home. But this is a census of people working outside their homes. So when it says tabacerias, it means tobacco workshops or the factories that were growing at the time, tobacco factories, which were large workshops. No? Then we have the other four main trades, no? Sastrerias, zapaterias, panaderias. Well, so here we have the proportion of artisans that worked in these different trades. But if we look at the race of the workers in these trades, we have this. No? In tabacerias, 44% of all workers were black people. No? But in sasterias, they were almost 86%, zapaterias or shoemakers, 65%, panaderias, 75%, so bakeries, carpenters, 71%. Really a high proportion of black people in the measured trades. Then, it's interesting to see the proportion of slaves, of free blacks, we see that in certain trades they really dominate. But in tabacerias, we see that free blacks, they are not so numerous, no? It's only 16% of all workers. So many slaves work in a highly skilled trade like cigar making. So we see that the slavery and skill, they didn't conflict at all. We'll see that at a certain level, maybe, but at an average level of skill, slaves could be there all the time in a high proportion with no problem at all. Here we see percentage of the slaves in trades. We see in tabacerias almost a third of workers were slaves. So in a highly skilled trade, we have almost a third of workers being slaves. In sasterias, there are few, but then in panaderias, I don't know why, maybe because it was one of the toughest jobs, we have 74% slaves. Then the carpenters, 9%, and other trades, which is 40 trades altogether, we have an average of 17%. And here we see artisans according to freedom, status, and rank. Now, we see that among masters we have no slaves at all. Nonetheless, we have almost 30% of masters were black people. So we see even in the top ranks of the artisan world, we have a high proportion of black people. But then if we see at the journeymen, oficiales, and apprentices, before the indentured apprenticeship system was established, the proportion of blacks is between 56 and 80%. So really a high proportion. So we see that in the lower level of the artisan world, the proportion of black people, even slaves, is very high. In the top ranks of the artisan world, the proportion of blacks is less. Nonetheless, 30%, it's quite a bit. Regarding the urban setting, Sato expressed the need to expand manual trades to include more white workers in them, because those existing were mostly in the hands of black people. According to him, poor whites were afraid of losing their superior class status, he uses the word class, if they participated in trades dominated by black artisans. He also wanted that whites started to work alongside blacks in the sugar and coffee plantations. To make whites participate in manual trades and to suppress beggars in general, the economic society had to establish more schools for the popular classes with economic aid of the colonial administration and private donations. Despite Sacco's alarm, in most urban trades there were both blacks and whites. Nonetheless, blacks tended to dominate the less skilled ones, such as cooks and bricklayers, while whites dominated the skilled ones, such as jewelers, sorry for my pronunciation, and cigar selectors, choosing the cigars after they had been manufactured. It was one of the best paid, more skilled trades. Following the obsession of the Creole elite in whitening Cuba, Sacco also wanted more whites in all manual trades. He was especially worried about the fact that there were several trades that required average skill, where the majority of workers were blacks. This was the real problem for Sacco, not bricklayers. He wanted, like, tailors to become predominantly white, because he wanted to whiten artisans, to force whites into having harder working conditions, which till that moment they didn't have. And even both white artisans and free blacks, they always dreamt by buying one or two slaves and then live out from this tiny slave ownership they would have. So they were not against slavery at the time so much, and the slave society even provided certain benefits for white artisans and even free black artisans. Although Sacco never mentioned specifically the establishment of a system of indentured apprenticeship, he presented all the factors that would lead other members of the economic society to devise this sort of semi-free labor. In 1831, the Sociedad started a debate on prison reform and the need to introduce workshops in them. A year later, the branch of the economic society in Camagüey, in the eastern half of the island, but not in the eastern end of the island, was already teaching manual trades to vagrant children delivered by their parents or legal guardians to the economic society branch in Camagüey. Back in Havana, the process of establishing the indentured apprentice system began in 1835, when the economic society created its industry section, a permanent commission in charge of this task. Probably the abolition of slavery in 1834 in the British Empire, where slaves were retained as unfree workers under the name of apprentices, triggered this process in Cuba. Nonetheless, usually the Cuban elite tended to borrow ideas on labor regulation from France, not Britain. And certainly, the apprenticeship system that was established in Cuba in 1839 was very different from the short-lived apprenticeship system that existed in the British Caribbean. In 1836, the industry section of the economic society started to publish a statistical data on the free and slave workers, in all workshops in Havana and nearby towns. This was a preliminary study to establish a system of apprenticeship among young people, whether they were orphaned, the sons of hard-working parents that could not educate them properly, or vagrants. The men, but not the slaves. That's why we don't find the slaves among indentured apprentices, because the slaves, since they were already bound by slavery, they were not put into indenture. The main promoter was Agustin de Ferretti, a leading member of the Havana elite and a strong supporter of Spanish rule in Cuba. From then until 1839, The society debated the details about how to indenture apprentices. As the economic society prepared to establish a system of indentured apprenticeship, initially it suggested that contracts had to last 5 years. However, later on, the industry section made clear that this was just a suggestion, and that the maximum time that indentured apprentices could serve had to be much longer. According to this section, the best would be a short period of training and a long period of indenture where training didn't play a role, to help masters obtain benefits from the indentured apprentices as a compensation for teaching the trade to them. All masters were forced to accept at least one apprentice, and each neighborhood would have an inspector for the apprentices. After their term of service, apprentices could become journeymen or masters. Actually, this is how it was implemented. In 1837, La Casa de Beneficencia, the orphan's house, had suppressed its apprenticeship services due to lack of money. So the economic society became very worried, and probably this crisis of the orphan house triggered the start, finally, of the indentured apprenticeship system in all of Havana. In 1838, the orphan house recovered its workshops where kids were trained to become artisans. These were more or less indentured apprentices already. Again, the orphan house was imposing a training period of at least 5 or 6 years. Finally, in July 1839, indentured apprenticeship was established in Havana at the time. Havana had a permanent number of some 4,000 apprentices. But the industry section of the economic society only managed to have between 1,200 and 1,400 boy apprentices and very few girl apprentices, permanently indentured. Although the economic society regarded this as a very small number, if we add the slaves who already were apprentices and the traditional agreements between their owners and the masters of workshops, we see that altogether nearly half of all apprentices in Havana were either indentured or slaves. Therefore, free labor represented a very high proportion of all artisans under the situation of apprenticeship in Havana. There's certain balance between the apprentices that were indentured regarding race. We see that initially there was a sort of black kids' hand. No? They handed down really black kids. We have 672 in 1839 and 40, and only 181 white children or boys. But later on we see that more or less they were catching both in the same proportion black and white apprentices. We see that also altogether between 1839 and 1857, when I no longer have data on the system, about 10,000 apprentices were indentured. This is not such a small number. It's just the society was complaining about not having absolute control over the process. But this, despite this complaint, doesn't mean they didn't have an impact. No? I truly believe that having 10,000 indentured apprentices in a city like Havana is not such a small number. Also, we see that every year about 300, 400, even 500 or 600 boys were handed an indenture, and that only 100 and 200 titles of journeymen were issued. No? So after the 4, 5, 6 years of starting the system, we should be seeing that the society was issuing a similar number of degrees of trade to exercise trade as journeymen as the people being handed and indentured. But we see that only 150 or 200 titles were issued every year. So what happened to the other 100, 200, 300, 400 boys that were indentured? We see that many of them, they didn't get the title. they entered the job market without being fully acknowledged as journeymen or in some cases masters. No? We only have between 50 or 60 and even less titles as masters every year, sometimes only 10 per year. Here we see how apprentices were put in workshops according to the demand that was in Havana, no? That there was in Havana. We see that tabaqueros, cigar makers, they are 49%. It was really trying to find labor for the largest growing industry in the city, which was cigar making. Then people who worked, who were put to work as apprentices in the tobacco industry were between 50 and 70% every year. So apprentices sent to the tobacco industry were between 50 and 70. This shows how much the tobacco industry was probably the cause for establishing this system. No? We have also that shoemakers only receive 10% of these artisans, or bricklayers 5%. The rest of the trades received even less. Also, it's interesting to see the regulations regarding the number of years. No? In the regulations approved in 1837, I believe, we see that the apprentices had to remain under the guardianship of the industry section of the economic society for a period that could last for 10 years for boys and 11 for girls. It seems that they considered that since girls produced less wealth, they had to serve more time. Or also, they were talking about girls getting pregnant, so it was better to put another year extra for girls. No? But the proportion of girls was very tiny as apprentices. In the case they became sick or that they ran away, they had to serve more time. This was way above the time needed to learn the trade. According to articles published in the Journal of the Economic Society, it took 4 years as apprentice to become a sugar master, probably the most skilled trade in Cuba. So, and actually, the article that talks about sugar master says that in 2 years a person could learn to become a sugar master, but that 2 more years were needed to make sure the apprentice learned completely the trade. But in only 2 years, really an apprentice could become a sugar master. So why having people 10, 11 years? Obviously to force them to work for free. No? Also we have that average skill trades like iron monger, alambiquero, needed 2 years of training. Last, it seems that to become a cigar maker, in only 1 year a person could become a cigar maker. So we see that learning the trade and the traditional apprentice system would be from 1 to 2 years, maybe 3 years, and in a very extreme case, 4 years. Okay. Now we have a system where people have to work for 10, 11, and some cases. I have a case in which I found a boy who had been indentured for 10 years, and after he became a journeyman, they re-indentured him as an apprentice. So really, you see that didn't make any legal sense, and nonetheless, this person was re-indentured. Also, we have the case of a boy where his legal guardian was fake, and a relative complained that his nephew had been indentured, and that the supposed legal guardian of this person was a fake guardian. The administration acknowledged that it had hired and indentured this boy through a fake guardian, and nonetheless said, but the indenture is legal and the boy is going to remain as an apprentice indentured, as an indentured apprentice. So we see that legal forms were not really very strict from the side of the administration. They were very flexible in terms of indentured. Every boy they wanted to indenture. Also, we see that at the indenture, there was a high degree of cruelty in the workshops. No, the whip was constantly used. Stocks and fetters were used. Boys that ran away and the proportion was high were sent to jail. Later on, a specific, how to say, not jail, but a specific place for apprentices was created so they didn't mix with regular criminals, and in this place also they received harsh punishment. We also have that the situation was so strict or so tough for some that they found cases in which apprentices went to the deposit of runaway slaves and they said, I am a slave, because in the deposit for runaway slaves they would receive food and in general they were not punished. So we see theoretically free worker saying I am a slave at least for a period to get food and stay more or less well for a while. No? Since Spain kept a strict record of who was a slave or not, later on it was always discovered who was the slave and who not. But I have found cases in which boys went to the deposit of slaves. Then the proportion of runaway apprentices was very high. The society, the way the police catch these apprentices is quite astonishing. Because initially, the first year, 50% of the runaway apprentices were not caught. But the second year, 96% were caught. So we see that the police system was very efficient. In 1 or 2 days, the kids were caught. And only 6 apprentices per year managed to run away from the system. And usually these apprentices that run away from indentured apprenticeship would be caught later on. So we see that the slave society really emphasized police control and very efficiently. The proportion of runaway apprentices, it's hard to know, but we have that in 1844, out of 513 who had been recruited into the system, 121 ran away. So the proportion is 25%. The society said that this wasn't a high proportion, but I find that 25% of runaway apprentices during part of the year is not so low. This created a very litigious system in which every year between 300 and 600 appeals were processed through the economic society. And we see that the society not always decided against apprentice. When there was too much violence in the punishments, the society could intervene against the master. So we have that slave society could not be only about punishment. It had to be some ways of correcting this system, because if not, the system would have exploded. We have that really the society was not always prizing punishment. We have also the society intervening to stop excessive punishment. Well, really, I only mentioned apprentices. I was about to mention also the Libreta del Tabaquero, which is linked to apprenticeship, but since I think if I start talking about the booklet of the Tabaquero or the cigar maker, I could make this talk too long. I'll just mention that besides the indentured apprenticeship system, after 1847, we also have Chinese indenture for 4 years. Everybody thinks about Chinese indenture as being planned for sending people to the fields, but a high proportion of, not a high, a certain proportion of indentured Chinese would go to the cities. And later on, the Chinese managed, since they were not 100% slaves, they were indentured Chinese, they found a way of going into the cities. And really we have a new category of semi-free labor in Cuban cities, the Chinese indentured, till 1874. So we have indentured Chinese after 1847. We have the booklet of the cigar maker, which was a mechanism to have debt, a sort of debt peonage imposed on cigar makers who were supposedly, most of them, free workers. But the libreta was imposed on slave cigar makers, because slave cigar makers, it's not like indentured cigar makers, it's different. Slave cigar makers could have the booklet, they could not be indentured as apprentices, but they could have, they could suffer the booklet. So we have all these mechanisms. Why all this failed in the long run? Because in the late 50s, first of all, we have a terrible economic crisis that decreased enormously. In 1857, the demand for labor in the tobacco industry decreased for like 7 years. Also, the Creole elite, after being too excluded from the administration, in the late 1850s and early 1860s, wanted colonial reform, wanted to participate more in the colonial administration. Since it needed allies, it looked to artisans for support. So, although it had been promoting the indenture and enslavement of any artisan they could, now the Creole elite started to talk about the right of artisans. In the 1860s, we really have the Cuban labor movement being founded, in a sense, and the first thing the labor movement did is to try to crush these forms of semi-free labor. So, to end the talk, because I know I'm borrowing some extra minutes, I'd like to mention that artisans initially were not so interested, especially the most skilled ones, about destroying these forms of coerced labor, if they didn't affect them. But since we see that they were really widespread, we have that in the 1860s, among tailors, we have strikes or strike attempts where in the documents I found, the administration says it's scary because people of different race and freedom condition join together in these strike attempts. Then we have letters being sent to the administration where artisans say, oh, we want these rights, and they don't say we are white or black, or slaves or non-slaves. And then in 1866 we have the reading of books in the tobacco factories, which was used to attempt to found labor organizations which were not founded at the time, although books in Cuba emphasize they were not. But underground networks certainly were established, because in 1867 we have a big strike that has been very little documented, and it's the first big strike in Cuba. There are some minor strikes before, but the 1867 strike really affected thousands of workers. And from then on, we have a labor movement very much integrated, led by white artisans, but this was overcome by anarchists in the 1880s. And really, we have a labor movement that grew and expanded quickly after the first war of independence in Cuba, the 10 Years' War between 1866, 68, and 78. This war, it's a whole theme in itself. Really, Cuba changed a lot. Urban Cuba changed a lot during the 10 Years' War, but this is a theme I kind of go into now. And let me finish by saying that all these forms of coerced labor, they created this really flexible urban society where people of different race and freedom status merged. And I believe this is the basis for Cuban society today, where we have a high degree of social mixture at all levels. I'm sorry for the time I borrowed. Thank you very much for your question.